Everyone in the neighborhood thought they knew me. A quiet sheriff, living a quiet life in a quiet suburban street, keeping to my routines, my family, my daughter. But no one ever really looked past the facade. No one ever imagined the storm brewing just beneath the surface. Not HOA Karen, not anyone. It started on a morning that should have been ordinary. The sun was just breaking over the rooftops, golden light glinting off freshly washed windows, birds chirping like nothing in the world could go wrong. My daughter, fragile and bright, was sitting on the porch swing, humming softly, her wheelchair parked at the edge of the walkway. Her laughter was small but full of life, a sound I had learned to treasure more than anything. And then I saw her, Karen, HOA Karen, the woman with a reputation as sharp as her stiletto heels, sharp as her words, sharp as the grudges she held for decades. She was marching up the driveway, eyes cold, posture rigid, as though the world had wronged her personally. And for whatever reason that morning, she had chosen my family as the target. "You shouldn't be here," she spat, voice loud enough to carry across the street. My daughter froze, turning her head toward the sound, confusion and fear mixing in her eyes. I stepped forward instinctively, chest tight, heart hammering, not because I didn't know Karen, but because I knew what she was capable of when cornered, when her pride was threatened. "Back off, Karen," I said calmly but firm. Calm was a mask. Calm was all that stood between reason and chaos. She sneered. She didn't care. She never did. And then it happened, the moment that split the day in two. Her hand, her terrible, reckless hand, reached for something. I saw it in slow motion, the way parents see danger before it strikes, a glint of metal, the shadow of intent. My daughter cried out. I didn't even think. I moved. Faster than anyone could imagine, but not fast enough. A shot rang out. The world spun. The neighbor's dog barked in panic. Windows rattled. For a heartbeat, nothing existed but the sound and the ache in my chest. My daughter slumped and my knees nearly gave way. And then reality snapped back in. I was a sheriff, not just a parent, a protector. And in that moment, all the careful measures I had built my life around meant nothing. Karen stood frozen, wide-eyed, not expecting the recoil, not expecting the fury that now burned in me. She hadn't counted on the man behind the uniform. The man who had sworn an oath long before this street, long before her petty HOA crusades. The man who could handle this, could control it, could dismantle her recklessness with the weight of law and authority. I grabbed her arm before she could raise it again. My voice was quiet but lethal. "Do you have any idea who you're messing with?" For a second, she didn't. She saw a sheriff, yes, but she didn't see the father. The father who had trained his body and mind for situations like this, who had spent years carrying the responsibility of keeping people alive. And she didn't see the community, the neighbors who had silently watched her escalate conflicts over mailboxes, paint colors, fences, who would now witness the consequences of a step too far. In that moment, I realized how fragile our lives were, how quickly ordinary mornings could fracture into chaos, and how little people understood the thin line between civility and violence. Karen was about to learn the hard way that actions have repercussions, that arrogance, cruelty, and spite, especially when aimed at the innocent, always come back to meet you. I looked down at my daughter. Her eyes met mine, wide and trembling. There was fear there, yes, but also trust. And that trust, fragile and precious, was all I needed to know. This wasn't just about authority. This wasn't just about the law. This was about family, about justice, about protecting the ones who can't fight back. And as Karen realized her miscalculation, the street seemed to hold its breath. No one spoke. No one moved. The tension was electric, suffocating, and in that pause, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. Life would never be the same here again. Not after today. Not after Karen decided to challenge the wrong family. The street was silent, but it wasn't peace. It was the kind of silence that hangs heavy, full of accusation, full of anticipation. My daughter trembled slightly in her wheelchair, the sunlight glinting off the chrome wheels, casting tiny shadows that danced across the driveway. I could feel Karen's gaze on me, sharp and calculating, her mind racing faster than her legs could carry her. You're a sheriff?" she stammered, disbelief cracking her usual arrogance. Her voice was lower now, hesitant, almost human for a fleeting second, but it didn't last. Pride always fights to the end, even when it should crumble. "Yes," I said quietly, calm again, but beneath it a storm brewed. My hand hovered just in case, my heart still hammering in my chest. Every muscle, every nerve was alive with adrenaline, not just from her recklessness, but from the understanding of what could have happened and what could still happen. She flinched, then straightened, trying to regain her composure. I didn't mean," her words faltered under the weight of reality. She had meant everything she had done, every petty fight over fences, every complaint over garden colors, every malicious report she filed to our HOA board. This wasn't accidental. This was escalation. And now she faced consequences far beyond what she had imagined. I studied her, noting the way she shifted from confident to terrified in mere seconds. It was a pattern I had seen in my job countless times. People who think rules are for others, who wield power recklessly until they meet someone willing and able to hold them accountable. And I realized then, watching her, that karma is subtle but relentless. It doesn't announce itself. It waits, and it hits harder when least expected. Neighbors began to emerge, slowly at first, peeking from behind curtains, stepping cautiously into their driveways. They had seen Karen's antics before, but nothing like this. And they had seen me, quiet, approachable, always the man waving back from the porch, but they didn't know the other side of the sheriff they lived beside. The side that could dismantle chaos with measured force, with experience and precision. I bent down to my daughter, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You're okay," I said softly, though my own heart still raced. "I've got you," she nodded, gripping my hand, eyes wide but trusting. That trust, so pure and unbroken, was stronger than any weapon, stronger than fear. Karen tried to speak again, but the words died in her throat. She knew, deep down, that she had stepped over a line, and the line wasn't just a neighborhood rule. It was the line between civility and life-altering consequences. Then, without warning, she did something that surprised even me. She lunged, not physically, but with her voice, her fury, her indignation. "You think you're better than me?" she shouted. "You think just because you have a badge you can?" Her sentence trailed off as she realized no one was on her side anymore. The neighbors were watching. My family was safe, and for the first time, she wasn't in control. Control, it's what she had always craved. Control over the community, control over appearances, control over my life, over my daughter's life. And now she was faced with the one truth she could never manipulate. Power doesn't always protect you. Justice does. And sometimes justice comes from the quietest people, the ones you underestimate, the ones you think are ordinary. I straightened, feeling the weight of my authority settle over the street. Not the badge, not the uniform, but the presence of a father who would not be crossed, a sheriff who had trained for moments like this, a man who had seen life at its most fragile and most dangerous. "Karen," I said slowly, every syllable deliberate, "you need to leave, now, before this gets worse." Her eyes widened, realizing finally that there was no argument, no loophole, no petty HOA rule that could save her. The veneer of her power cracked, revealing desperation beneath. And in that moment I understood why people fear karma, not because it's loud or cruel, but because it's precise. It doesn't miss. She stumbled backward, muttering under her breath, retreating down the street. The tension didn't immediately leave the air. It lingered like smoke after a fire, a warning to anyone who thought small acts of cruelty could go unpunished. And I turned back to my daughter, feeling the enormity of what had just happened settle in my chest. It wasn't just about protecting her from harm. It was about showing her the boundaries of the world. That sometimes people will do terrible things, not because you provoke them, but because of who they are. That justice, calm and deliberate, is often the only weapon against chaos. And that even in the darkest, most terrifying moments, family is the anchor. As the neighbors slowly returned to their routines, glancing over shoulders, whispering about what had just occurred, I knew this street would never be the same. Karen's shadow had receded, but the memory of her recklessness would linger, a reminder that even quiet streets harbor storms, and sometimes those storms reveal who we truly are. I wheeled my daughter inside, closing the door slowly, listening to the soft click of the lock. Inside, our home felt safe, warm. Outside, the world continued, some oblivious, some wary. But in that moment, I allowed myself to breathe, to process, to acknowledge the fear, the anger, the love that coursed through me. And I knew, as I looked at her sleeping later that night, that the fight was far from over. Karen may have backed down today, but the undercurrents of our neighborhood were deep, tangled, and unpredictable. And as a father, a sheriff, a protector, I was ready. Because one lesson had never been clearer. Those who threaten the innocent do so at their own peril. And those who wield authority without empathy, without understanding, eventually meet someone who does. Why do some people insist on making their lives and yours misery for sport? That question kept replaying in my mind as the days after Karen's reckless act stretched on. My daughter was recovering, mostly shaken, mostly frightened, but alive. And I was left to navigate a neighborhood that suddenly felt different, tainted, tense, watching. Karen didn't just disappear. That was never her style. She simmered, she plotted. And in a way only HOA Karen could, she began a quiet campaign. Complaints about noise, complaints about lawn maintenance, reports of alleged safety hazards. Petty, ridiculous, and yet calculated. She wanted to unsettle us. She wanted us to feel small, to doubt ourselves, to be humiliated in front of the neighbors who had witnessed the confrontation days before. I watched her from my window one morning, clipboard in hand, marching down the street with that self-important stride, muttering to herself like the entire world existed solely to be ordered by her. I clenched my fists, not because I was scared. Fear had nothing to do with it, but because I knew the line between annoyance and danger is thinner than most people think, and Karen had already crossed it once. Every visit from the HOA board reminded me of her influence, smiles, nods, polite tones, but eyes that whispered her loyalty. She had woven herself into the system, creating allies in quiet corners, painting me as a difficult neighbor, as a man prone to overreaction. No one knew the truth. No one knew the depth of what had happened, the shot, the fear, the adrenaline, only me, only my daughter. Only the quiet weight of justice and protection that had settled over my shoulders like a cloak I could never remove. And yet I couldn't react the way instinct screamed. I couldn't storm the board meetings, slam down evidence of her recklessness, brandish my authority. That would make me the villain, the overbearing sheriff, the man abusing his badge. My daughter's safety and her innocence was still paramount. And in the quiet moments I realized that strategy, patience, and precise action were the only weapons I had. One afternoon I was rolling my daughter toward the mailbox, sunlight cutting sharp angles across the freshly painted fences when I noticed Karen again. She was crouched near one of the yards, measuring something, snapping photos, scribbling notes, always observing, always documenting, always plotting, and always, I realized, underestimating me, underestimating what I could do. "Why do people like her exist?" my daughter whispered softly, her voice carrying the kind of fear that pierces a parent's chest. I paused, crouched to her level, and took her hand. "Because sometimes people believe their rules are stronger than love," I said, "but they're wrong, always wrong." That day, as the sun dipped lower, shadows stretching across the neighborhood, a new thought took root in my mind. I could continue to endure Karen's petty tyranny. I could smile politely, let the HOA board frown and scold, and allow her to chip away at our peace. Or I could let the truth surface in a way she could never anticipate. There was power in restraint, yes, but there was also power in timing, in patience, in letting someone think they are winning while preparing a moment that would change everything. Karen had chosen to challenge me once in the worst way possible, and she hadn't counted on a father's vigilance, on a sheriff's experience, on the quiet, calculated courage of a family that refused to be intimidated. I started watching more closely, noting patterns. The way she timed her inspections, the way she positioned herself for maximum effect, the way she expected neighbors to follow her cues like puppets. And I realized something crucial. The battle wasn't just personal, it was public. The moment she miscalculated again, the neighborhood would see the full weight of her recklessness, and I would be ready. It wasn't about revenge. That would be simple, and simple is rarely effective. It wasn't about anger. Anger is loud, visible, and can be used against you. No, it was about preparation, observation, understanding her moves before she understood mine. I was no longer reacting, I was strategizing. Every complaint she filed, every glance she threw, every whisper in the HOA hallways was a piece of a puzzle. And slowly, silently, I was assembling the picture. My daughter, sensing the tension I carried, asked one evening, "Daddy, will she come back?" Her small hand gripped mine, eyes wide. I looked into them, feeling a swell of love and resolve that almost hurt. "If she does, we'll handle it," I said firmly. "We always do, and you'll see why it's not about fear, it's about standing strong, together." The weeks that followed were a dance of subtle intimidation from Karen and quiet vigilance from me. Every lawn complaint, every trivial safety notice, every whispered rumor she attempted to seed was cataloged in my mind, analyzed, filed. I let the board think they were in control. I let Karen think she was pulling the strings. But beneath it all, I was waiting for the right moment, for the perfect misstep, for karma to arrive in its quiet, inevitable way. Then one day the neighborhood erupted, not with a fight, not with a confrontation, but with suspicion. A missing mailbox, a broken fence post, a garden sprayed with bleach. Karen was flustered, visibly unprepared. Her smug composure faltered, revealing panic. And I realized something. Every action has a reaction. Every cruel intention leaves a mark. And when you're reckless enough to test the wrong family, the fallout is never quiet. I wheeled my daughter past the chaos that evening, the sun casting long, dramatic shadows across the suburban street. She squeezed my hand and whispered, "You'll fix it, won't you?" I smiled, a tight, quiet smile that held secrets she didn't need to understand yet. "I always do," I said, and I meant it. Because Karen had started a war she didn't understand. And in this war, patience, strategy, and love were stronger than fear, stronger than arrogance, stronger than every petty rule she had ever wielded. And the truth, the inevitable truth, was coming. It just needed the right moment. The night was quiet, deceptively so. Streetlights glowed like watchful eyes, casting long shadows that flickered over neatly trimmed lawns. But I knew better. Quiet streets often hide the loudest storms. And HOA Karen was a storm in human form, relentless, vindictive, and utterly unpredictable. It started with small things: notes slipped under our door, anonymous complaints filed online, strange phone calls in the evening that hung heavy with intent. Every action was a test, a probe. She was searching for weakness, for fear, for a crack she could exploit, and every time she thought she had it, I reminded myself I had seen worse, I had endured worse, and I would protect my daughter at any cost. One evening I was in the kitchen, reviewing my day's notes. Every HOA complaint, every suspicious activity, every pattern Karen had left in her wake, when I heard it. A single, sharp sound from the front yard. My heart clenched. I moved silently, instinct guiding me, every sense on high alert. By the time I reached the front porch, the world seemed to hold its breath. There she was, Karen, standing near the edge of our driveway, a determined, furious look on her face. And in her hand I froze, a weapon, small but deadly. My mind raced. She had crossed the line, again, but this time it wasn't a petty complaint or a threat. This was recklessness personified, and I realized in a chilling instant that the stakes had escalated beyond HOA rules. "Karen," I said calmly, though every muscle in my body was coiled, ready to act. "Put it down now." Her eyes narrowed, her pride refusing to let her yield. She didn't understand who I was, not fully. She didn't understand that the man standing before her, calm and measured, was trained to respond in seconds, to neutralize threats without hesitation. She saw only a neighbor. She saw only a target. And then it happened. The shot rang out. A scream tore through the night, sharp and raw. Time slowed. I ran, heart pounding, toward the sound. My daughter was screaming too, panicked and terrified, and my instincts, both as a father and a sheriff, took over completely. By the time I reached her, she was unharmed, shaking in her wheelchair, tears streaming down her face. The bullet had missed by inches, but Karen froze. She realized just a fraction too late the depth of her mistake. I stepped forward, uniform now irrelevant, father now fully unleashed. "Do you know what you've done?" I demanded. "Do you have any idea who you're messing with?" Her face paled, her composure evaporating. For the first time, the facade cracked, revealing panic, confusion, and fear. She had assumed control. She had assumed power, but she had miscalculated, and I would make sure she understood exactly what that recklessness meant. Neighbors were emerging now, drawn by the sound of chaos. Phones out, faces pale, whispers spreading like wildfire. Karen's influence, built over years of petty tyranny and false authority, crumbled under the weight of her own actions. And in that moment, the truth became undeniable. Arrogance has limits. Recklessness has consequences. And crossing a parent who is also a trained sheriff is an error no one should make. I kept my voice calm, deliberate, even as adrenaline surged through me. "Step away," I said, "now, before this gets worse." She hesitated, caught between fear and pride. But the truth, the undeniable reality of her mistake, was evident. Slowly, almost reluctantly, she backed away. Her weapon lowered, her confidence shattered. She had pushed too far, tested the wrong family. And now she was facing the reality that some lines, once crossed, cannot be ignored or undone. I turned to my daughter, pulling her into my arms, whispering reassurances. "It's okay," I said softly. "You're safe. You're always safe with me." Her small hands clutched my shirt, trusting, unbroken, and my heart swelled with a mixture of love and fury. Protecting her was more than duty, it was instinct. It was the core of who I was, and no petty HOA tyrant would ever change that. Karen fled, stumbling down the street, muttering under her breath, defeated but alive. She had survived, yes, but she had learned the hard way that threats aimed at the innocent meet consequences far beyond petty reprimands or complaints. And the neighborhood, witnessing the events unfold, would never look at her the same way again. Her reign of intimidation, built over years of whispers and letters, was over. As I closed the door behind us, I allowed myself a moment to breathe, to feel the weight of what had just happened. This wasn't just about my daughter. It wasn't just about Karen. It was about the reminder that vigilance, patience, and courage are powerful tools, That authority, wielded wisely, protects more than laws, it protects lives. And in that quiet, after the chaos had subsided, I realized something else. My daughter, fragile but fierce, had witnessed the lengths to which I would go to protect her. She had seen the truth of justice, the quiet strength of love, and the reality that family is a shield stronger than fear itself. Corinne's actions had escalated the conflict beyond HOA regulations. She had crossed a line that should never have been crossed. And as I tucked my daughter into bed that night, watching her finally drift into sleep, I knew the next steps had to be calculated, precise, inevitable. She would face accountability, not vengeance, but the undeniable consequences of recklessness. Because sometimes, people need to learn that the world is not theirs to control. That power without empathy is fragile, and that the smallest, most unassuming family on a quiet suburban street can contain a storm no one sees coming until it hits. How quickly the neighborhood changed after that night. Corinne had fled, but the echoes of her recklessness lingered in every corner, the whispered conversations, the cautious glances, the subtle tension that pulsed like electricity through the streets. People had seen something they didn't understand, something they wouldn't forget, and Corinne, for all her pride, knew she had crossed a line she couldn't undo. I kept my daughter close, watching her laugh softly in the safety of our home, feeling a mixture of relief and anger that churned beneath my calm exterior. She deserved normalcy. She deserved a world where her wheelchair wasn't a target, where the streets weren't battlegrounds. And I was determined to give her that, even if it meant confronting the chaos Corinne had created head-on. The HOA board called a meeting the following week, their emails polite, their tone measured, but their eyes betraying unease. Corinne was present, of course, her posture stiff, her smile brittle. She had clearly spent the week trying to craft a narrative that painted me as the aggressor, the overreacting father, the troublemaker sheriff. But she underestimated one crucial fact. I had observed everything. Every complaint she filed, every whispered rumor, every petty attempt at intimidation was cataloged in my mind, organized like evidence for a case that could not be ignored. As I walked into the meeting room, the familiar hum of suburban civility greeted me. Chairs were neatly arranged, tables polished, papers stacked with the precision of bureaucratic obsession. But beneath it, tension simmered, thick and palpable. Corinne's eyes flicked toward me, calculating, searching for weakness. I didn't flinch. I didn't react. I simply watched. The discussion began with routine complaints, noise levels, fence heights, landscaping issues. But I could see Corinne itching to escalate, to push, to make the moment about her. And when she did, I let her speak. Every word, every accusation, every insinuation was a thread she believed would unravel me. But I didn't respond immediately. I observed. I measured. I waited for the perfect moment. When it came, it was subtle but powerful. A misplaced accusation about our lawn, a false claim that our daughter's wheelchair violated some obscure regulation. Corinne's face flushed with triumph, her smile sharp, her voice loud. And then I spoke, quietly, deliberately, calmly. "You're mistaken," I said. "Not only is the complaint invalid, but the behavior that led to this complaint, targeting my family, attempting to intimidate a child, is unacceptable and documented." I let the weight of my words hang in the air. The room went silent. Neighbors leaned forward, eyes wide. The HOA board members shifted uncomfortably. Corinne's face drained of color. Her defenses, carefully constructed over years, crumbled under the reality of undeniable truth. I continued, showing the board the documentation, the patterns, the timeline of threats and reckless behavior. Every complaint she had filed against us, every petty maneuver, every attempt to assert dominance, laid bare. And the room, once filled with tension in her favor, now tilted. Her influence, built over years of manipulation, evaporated under the clarity of evidence. Corinne tried to speak, to interrupt, to defend herself, but the words faltered. The power dynamic had shifted. The arrogance that had propelled her forward for so long was powerless against the truth. And in that moment I realized something crucial. Sometimes justice isn't loud or vengeful. Sometimes it's quiet, precise, undeniable. As the meeting ended, Corinne left, shoulders slumped, expression a mix of frustration and disbelief. She had lost, not through rage, not through retaliation, but through patience, strategy, and the unwavering protection of a family. And for the first time, the neighborhood saw her as she truly was, flawed, reckless, and ultimately accountable for her actions. Back home, I wheeled my daughter to the porch, the sun setting in brilliant streaks across the horizon. She looked at me, her small hands gripping mine, and whispered, "Daddy, you made it stop." I nodded, pulling her close, feeling the truth in her trust. "We made it stop," I said. Together. That evening, as shadows stretched across the quiet suburban street, I realized the larger lesson. Koren had been a test, not just of patience or of authority or even of courage, but of resilience, of strategy, and of love. Protecting what matters isn't always about confrontation. Sometimes it's about endurance, observation, and the quiet assurance that justice will prevail if you wait for the right moment. In the days that followed, the neighborhood began to breathe again. Smiles returned. Laughter echoed across fences, and while Koren still lingered in whispers and sidelong glances, her threat had diminished. The balance had shifted. The scales of civility and chaos were restored, not because I sought revenge, but because I demanded accountability. And my daughter, she began to play again on the porch, her wheelchair spinning gently as the sunlight warmed her face. Her trust in the world, fragile but resilient, had been preserved. And in that preservation, I found a deeper truth. Sometimes the strongest protection isn't force, but presence. Not anger, but vigilance. Not retaliation, but strategy. Koren had learned her lesson, though perhaps not fully. And the neighborhood, for better or worse, had seen a man and a family who would not be intimidated, who would not be passive in the face of danger. And in that quiet triumph, I understood something essential. Courage isn't always loud. Justice isn't always dramatic. And love for family, for the innocent, for what is right, is the most potent force of all. As night fell, I watched over my daughter, my eyes scanning the quiet streets, aware that vigilance never truly ends. But for the first time in weeks, the storm felt distant, the danger contained, and the future a little brighter. The air in the neighborhood was thick with unease, even after Koren's defeat at the HOA meeting. People whispered behind curtains, speculated over fences, and glanced nervously down quiet streets. Koren wasn't done. That much was clear. The fire in her eyes had dimmed, but it had not extinguished. And I could sense it. Every instinct honed over years of law enforcement told me she was planning something else, something desperate. It started subtly. A misplaced package, a strange scratch on the side of our garage, the faint odor of chemicals wafting from a neighbor's yard. Nothing overt, nothing immediately dangerous, but enough to remind me that Koren thrived on intimidation, on chaos, on testing boundaries. And the more I watched, the more I realized she was learning, adapting. One afternoon, I was wheeling my daughter down the sidewalk, the golden afternoon sun cutting long shadows across the manicured lawns. She hummed softly, her laughter fragile but bright, a reminder of why every precaution mattered. And then I saw her. Koren, across the street, crouched near a hedge, her movements deliberate. She was holding something, small, metallic, dangerous. My heart tightened. I stopped immediately, assessing, calculating. The neighbors were few, scattered. No one seemed aware of her presence, but I was. And in that instant, I understood this wasn't an accident. This was premeditation. The stakes had risen, and she had no idea who she was dealing with. I approached slowly, voice calm but firm. "Koren," I said, "step away now." Her eyes snapped toward me, recognition flickering into panic, but pride anchored her in place. She had come too far to back down now. She had convinced herself that she could intimidate us again, that she could reclaim control. And that's when it happened. She made the same mistake she had once before, underestimating the father, the sheriff, the protector who would not allow harm to come to the innocent. She lunged, not recklessly, but with intent. I saw it in the briefest instant, the glint of metal, the reckless determination, the refusal to yield. My daughter gasped. My body moved before thought even fully registered. Years of training, muscle memory honed by danger, took over. Within seconds, Koren was disarmed, grounded, and facing the consequences she had so long evaded. Neighbors emerged, drawn by the commotion, phones raised, eyes wide with shock. Koren's expression shifted from triumph to disbelief to sheer terror as she realized just how completely she had misjudged the situation. She wasn't just a neighborhood bully anymore. She was a person who had tried to harm a child and faced a father who would not compromise, a sheriff who could respond with lethal precision if necessary. I held her at bay, voice low but deadly calm. "Enough," I said. "Do you understand now? This ends today. Whatever plans you've been plotting, whatever chaos you thought you could cause, it stops here." Her pride crumbled, her composure shattered. She tried to speak, to argue, to regain some semblance of control, but the room, well, the street was filled with witnesses. She was exposed, vulnerable, and she had learned, finally, that power without accountability is fleeting. Turning back to my daughter, I knelt, brushing her hair back gently. "You're safe," I whispered. "I've got you, always." Her small hands gripped mine, and for a moment all the fear, all the tension, all the adrenaline dissipated into quiet relief. But the aftermath was not quiet. The HOA board called an emergency meeting. Karen's influence, already waning, crumbled completely under scrutiny. Every neighbor who had once feared her now looked to us with a mix of respect and awe. The truth was undeniable. Recklessness has limits, and crossing a father who is also a trained law enforcement officer is a line that cannot be ignored. As the board deliberated, I realized something essential. This wasn't about power. This wasn't about victory or vengeance. It was about accountability, about demonstrating that actions, even petty, vindictive ones, have real consequences. It was about showing my daughter and the neighborhood that courage and restraint, paired with unwavering protection, triumph over fear and arrogance. By evening, the neighborhood had begun to exhale. Karen had been formally reprimanded, her attempts at intimidation catalogued and exposed. The streets that had felt tense for weeks were slowly returning to normal. And yet, I knew better than to believe the storm had passed completely. Some lessons take time to settle. Some people require repeated reminders before they understand the reality of their actions. That night, I watched over my daughter as she slept, the soft rhythm of her breathing a reassurance and a warning all at once. She had witnessed chaos, danger, and fear, but she had also witnessed courage, protection, and the quiet certainty that love can overpower recklessness. And in that realization, I found my own quiet satisfaction. Karen may have tried to instill fear, to assert dominance, to disrupt our lives. But she had underestimated the bond between a parent and child, the vigilance of a trained sheriff, and the patience required to ensure justice is not just swift, but precise. As darkness fell over the suburban street, I knew the final act was approaching. The pieces were in place, the lessons had been demonstrated, and the neighborhood had seen the truth. And when the inevitable confrontation came, it would not be fear that prevailed. It would be accountability, courage, and the unbreakable bond of family. Because sometimes, people like Karen believe they can test the limits of civility, of order, of innocence. And sometimes, they need to learn that those limits exist for a reason, and that crossing them has consequences far beyond what they imagined. And in that quiet night, as I sat beside my daughter watching the moonlight settle softly across our porch, I knew the truth that had guided me through every threat, every intimidation, every reckless act. Protection is not passive. Courage is not loud. Justice is not always immediate. But when the moment comes, it is inevitable, and it is unstoppable. Why do people push limits even when the consequences are staring them in the face? That question echoed in my mind as Karen's antics escalated, each attempt more desperate than the last. She had learned nothing. Pride, arrogance, and a need for control outweighed caution. But she hadn't counted on one thing, that every misstep she made was being tracked, anticipated, and ultimately about to unravel completely. It started with small provocations, notes left on our car, cryptic messages slipped under doors, minor acts meant to unsettle, but escalated fast. One afternoon, I was in the backyard, checking the perimeter, ensuring every window was secure, every gate locked. My daughter was nearby, painting quietly on the patio, lost in her own little world. And then I saw her silhouette in the distance, Karen lurking near the side fence, a calculated look on her face, a new plan in motion. This time, I knew it wouldn't be just intimidation. She had grown reckless, emboldened by her belief that she could manipulate, that she could evade consequences yet again. And as I watched her, a chill ran down my spine, not fear, but focus. Every training, every instinct as a sheriff, every experience protecting the vulnerable came alive. This wasn't about confrontation anymore. This was about preemptive justice. I approached calmly, keeping my voice low, steady, deliberate. "Karen, step away, you don't want to do this," I warned. The words were measured, the tone unwavering, but inside I was calculating every possible outcome. She froze, her pride and panic warring in her eyes. She had underestimated me before. She would not underestimate me again. And then she moved, quick, decisive, reckless. The glint of her hand made my stomach tighten. It was an escalation, a clear act of aggression. In that split second, I acted. Years of training, muscle memory honed by danger, instincts sharpened by life-and-death situations, all of it guided me. Karen was disarmed, restrained, and facing the undeniable reality of her recklessness before anyone could react. Neighbors poured into their yards, drawn by the noise, phones out, eyes wide. Whispers spread like wildfire. Karen's facade, built over years of intimidation and subtle manipulation, crumbled instantly. She wasn't a figure of power anymore. She was a person exposed, vulnerable, and finally accountable for her actions. I held her at arm's length, voice calm but filled with authority. "This ends now," I said. Every action you've taken, every reckless threat, every attempt to harm the innocent documented, observed, accountable, do you understand? Panic overtook her pride. She tried to speak, to explain, to twist the narrative, but the words fell flat. She was surrounded by witnesses now, the HOA board members, neighbors, anyone who had once been under her subtle control. Her power, fragile and constructed, was shattered. And in that silence the truth became undeniable. Arrogance, when paired with recklessness, meets consequences. Always. I turned to my daughter, kneeling beside her, brushing her hair back gently. "You're safe," I whispered. "Always, that's the truth you need to know." Her small hands clutched mine, eyes wide but trusting, and I felt a wave of relief, love, and fury wash over me. Protecting her was more than duty, it was instinct. The HOA board convened immediately, unable to ignore the events unfolding in real time. Corinne's history of petty complaints, intimidation, and reckless acts were laid bare. Her influence evaporated under the weight of undeniable truth, every action catalogued, every pattern exposed. The neighbors who had once feared her now watched in awe as justice, calm and precise, replaced chaos. By the time the sun dipped behind the rooftops, the neighborhood had begun to breathe again. Corinne's attempts at intimidation were exposed and curtailed. Her reign of fear, built on arrogance and petty power plays, had collapsed under the weight of truth, vigilance, and calculated action. And my daughter, safe, resilient, and trusting, had witnessed the quiet strength of justice in action. But more than that, the lesson had been imparted. To the neighborhood, to Corinne, to anyone who believed power alone could dominate, intimidate, or harm, justice is not loud, it is not vengeful, it is precise, deliberate, and unwavering. And when the innocent are threatened, it manifests in ways those who underestimate it cannot ignore. As night settled over the suburban street, I sat beside my daughter on the porch, watching shadows stretch across the lawns, the soft glow of streetlights illuminating the calm. The storm had passed, but the echoes remained, reminders of what had been, what could have been, and what had to be endured to protect those we love. Corinne had learned, finally, that her recklessness carried consequences far beyond petty HOA rules. She had discovered that crossing a family who protects its own, especially a father who is also a sheriff, is a line that cannot be ignored. And as I looked at my daughter, peaceful now, I understood something essential. Courage, vigilance, and love are the truest forms of protection. The neighborhood would recover. Corinne would attempt to rebuild her influence, perhaps, but the foundation had shifted irreversibly. The scale had been corrected, not through fury, but through patience, precision, and the quiet power of unwavering justice. And in that restoration, I found a deep sense of satisfaction, knowing my daughter, our family, and the innocent in our community were safer because of it. Because sometimes people like Corinne push too far, act too recklessly, and underestimate the ones who stand for what is right. And when they do, the consequences are not loud or dramatic. They are inevitable, precise, unstoppable. And in the quiet of that night, I promised myself and my daughter that we would always stand ready. That threats, arrogance, and recklessness would never be allowed to dominate, intimidate, or harm again. The morning after the confrontation was quiet in a way that felt almost sacred. The street seemed lighter, almost hesitant to carry the weight of what had happened. Corinne was gone, her influence shattered, her intimidation exposed, and her arrogance finally humbled. The neighborhood could breathe again, but the memory of her recklessness lingered like a shadow, reminding everyone that chaos can strike in the most ordinary places. I wheeled my daughter onto the porch, the sun cutting through the leaves, warming her face. She smiled softly, the fragile glow of innocence restored, and I felt a mixture of relief and pride that was almost overwhelming. She had endured fear, uncertainty, and danger, and she had emerged resilient. She had seen strength not just in me as a father, but in the quiet courage that protects, observes, and ensures justice without malice. Neighbors began to step outside, exchanging cautious greetings, tentative smiles, a mixture of respect and awe evident in their eyes. They had witnessed the aftermath, seen the subtle shift in power, felt the weight of accountability as it settled on Corinne's absence. And slowly, a sense of normalcy returned, not the fragile kind that exists only on the surface, but the kind born of courage, vigilance, and the knowledge that justice had prevailed. Corinne's reign of petty tyranny, intimidation, and reckless aggression had ended not because of confrontation alone, but because truth, patience, and strategy had revealed the depth of her recklessness. She had underestimated the consequences of her actions, and the neighborhood had seen that actions aimed at the innocent meet a force they cannot anticipate or control. As my daughter played nearby, her laughter small but steady, I reflected on the lessons of the past weeks. Life in the suburbs, in an HOA-controlled world, can seem mundane, controlled, and safe. But it only takes one person to disrupt that equilibrium. And it only takes one family, determined and vigilant, to restore it. I thought about Karen, not with hatred, not with anger, but with clarity. She was a reflection of what happens when arrogance and recklessness go unchecked. She had chosen chaos over civility, intimidation over empathy, and in doing so, she had created a situation that could have destroyed trust, safety, and even lives. But she had not counted on the protective instincts of a father, the discipline of a sheriff, or the quiet courage of a family that refuses to yield. The HOA board, now fully aware of her actions, began the process of reinstating boundaries and accountability. Policies were clarified, measures taken to ensure no future threats would go unchecked, and neighbors began to feel the renewed sense of security that comes from a community united not by fear, but by shared vigilance and integrity. Karen's influence had crumbled, but her mistakes served as a cautionary tale, a reminder that power misused eventually meets resistance stronger than arrogance. Later that evening, I sat beside my daughter on the porch swing, her small hands entwined with mine. The sky above was painted in the soft hues of sunset, gold and rose blending with the fading light. "Daddy," she whispered, eyes wide, "will she come back?" I smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face, feeling the steady rhythm of her trust against my chest. "No," I said softly, and I meant it. "We faced her together and we made sure she can't hurt us again. The important thing is that we're safe, and we always will be." She leaned into me, resting her head against my shoulder, and I realized the truth of what we had endured. This wasn't just about defeating an adversary. It wasn't just about proving authority or asserting control. It was about resilience, about demonstrating that even in the face of fear and recklessness, love, courage, and vigilance prevail. It was about teaching her, the most important lesson of all, that safety, justice, and strength are not inherited. They are lived, every day in action, in presence, and in unwavering protection. As darkness settled over the neighborhood, the streets quiet and peaceful for the first time in weeks, I knew the work wasn't over, not entirely. Vigilance is never a one-time effort, but the foundation had been laid. My daughter was safe, our family was strong, and the neighborhood had witnessed the power of calm, measured justice. Karen had learned, finally, that actions aimed at harming the innocent are never without consequence. That arrogance unchecked is fragile. That misjudging a family united by love, resilience, and experience is a mistake that cannot be undone. And as the night deepened, I allowed myself a moment of quiet reflection, knowing that we had endured, prevailed, and emerged stronger, not because of anger or vengeance, but because of steadfast courage, unwavering vigilance, and the quiet power of family. I looked at my daughter, sleeping peacefully now, her small chest rising and falling, and I whispered a promise I would carry for the rest of my life. "I will always protect you. I will always stand guard, and no one will ever take your safety from us." The suburban street, bathed in the soft glow of moonlight, felt still but alive, a silent testament to the truth we had proven. Justice is not loud, it is precise. Courage is not reckless, it is deliberate. And love, the unyielding bond between parent and child, is the strongest force in the world. And in that quiet final moment, I realized that life would continue, the neighborhood would heal, and the memory of chaos would serve only as a reminder. Those who threaten the innocent, those who wield power without empathy, will always meet someone ready to stand, ready to protect, ready to ensure that justice, love, and resilience endure, always. You've heard this confession, now wait until you hear the next one, the truth that shatters everything you thought you knew.